Hello, everyone, and thanks to all of you who are out there joining us. I'm really excited to be here with you and to talk about how we can use data to manage personalized instruction for our students. As I move through the content, I want you all to be thinking about some of the challenges that you're already thinking about when I'm talking and some questions that you may have. And I want to encourage you to send those in during the presentation via the chat function. We look forward to answering those questions. I'll answer as many as I can during the Q&A. And if we don't get to your question, we'll be sure to follow up with you and get that question answered. In our last webinar series, we tried to cover the most relevant issues that a lot of our school leaders were dealing with, a lot of the concerns that they were dealing with, the challenges. The link at the bottom of this slide here is where you can find all of the content for those past webinars. I bring them up because there's lots of additional resources in those PowerPoints or in those presentations, that actually give more detail on a lot of the topics I'm discussing here today. So if you want any additional information on those topics, that link's going to be a great resource for you. And of course, you can always reach out to us with any questions that you have. The contact information will be on my last slide, so hope to hear from you. So here's the big question. What does your data tell you? For us, we're always asking the schools we work with a few things right away. First for me is, are your assessments measuring decoding and comprehension? And I bet you can imagine their responses. You know, they have multiple measures for decoding, phonemic awareness, word attack, but the comprehension assessments are somewhat lacking, and they typically measure higher order thinking skills like predictions, drawing conclusions, inferences, main idea. As we all know, there are very few things that educators and researchers in the field of education actually agree on. So when the National Reading Panel published and submitted their findings, gosh, it's 17 years ago now, can we all believe that? Back in 2000, it was pretty shocking that they all agreed on their conclusions. I mean, everyone agreed with their conclusions, which were, there are 5 crucial parts of reading, which we're all pretty familiar with now. Phonemic awareness is one that gets a lot of play. Phonics, of course. Fluency, which is a product of those two things for sure. And vocabulary and comprehension. Let's not forget, though, not just written language comprehension, but oral language comprehension is just as important, as we all know. So now, it's 17 years later, we still agree on those 5 component parts of reading being super important. But the discussion has evolved, which is really great. The questions now are more like, how are we assessing those skills, right? How are we using data to drive instruction? And does your targeted instruction match the skill you're measuring? I think that's a big one. That's one of the first questions I ask building leaders, teachers, when I meet with them for the first time. The other question is, do all of your tiers of instruction align based on the skills that you're measuring? In other words, if I have a student who struggles with a specific skill like sounding out words with complex blends with long vowel sounds, do I have them grouped with students like them, targeting those specific skills, or do I have them maybe in a guided reading group with students who are all struggling readers, but we're not really sure why? I think having been a classroom teacher, one of my biggest frustrations was how to manage those varying levels of abilities that my students had, also their varying levels of background knowledge, vocabulary levels. But what if I told you we could actually use your data to target those deficits and be prescriptive in our interventions, right? I'm going to be honest with you, when I left teaching because I didn't think that was actually possible. And I'm really thrilled to be here today to share with you some success stories on that front. This school, Haskin Elementary, which you got a little bit, if you watch the intro video, the lead-in video, a little bit more about that school, get to see some of the administrators there, hear from some of the teachers. But that school did exactly that. But not with just one student, not with a group of students or even a classroom of students. They did it building wide. Haskin Elementary is a rural school in Colorado, and it was designated as a turnaround school and qualified for a federally funded school improvement grant, which meant that they were in the bottom 5% in the state of Colorado in terms of performance. Picture a small rural Title I, high poverty, HighELL population. and to give you a better picture for this, their fourth graders were right around the 23% of their fourth graders were proficient in reading at that time when we first started with them. They did all the things on that last slide that I was just talking about and so much more. And in 3 years, that same cohort was 75% proficient in reading. So we know it's possible. Was it easy? It absolutely was not. And if you were to ask them, they would tell you that, but they would also say it was worth it. Lots of hard work, but worth the outcomes. Having taught in a rural part of California myself, I had a similar demographic that I was working with. HighELL population was about 98% ELL, 100% free and reduced lunch. And then, so this slide here is particularly something I'm interested in for sure, because I never thought it was possible. This is a subgroup that oftentimes is somewhat misunderstood in terms of their academic abilities. And by the way, the EL populations that we work with in our school districts we see the most gains in the shortest period of time with this subgroup. And it makes sense, though, if you think about it. We all know that an EL student presents the same way as a student with a cognitive impairment or a developmental delay on standardized testing. But the way we look at our data, the questions that we ask, right, that's the key to planning for instruction for that group. The minute you ask them a question about imagery, you find out really quickly that they don't have a deficit. It's just a language connection issue. And we know that with appropriate and explicit instruction, students who have been historically misunderstood, right, their profiles have, and underestimated, they can close the achievement gap as well. So how did Haskin do that, right? Their approach addressed those 5 component parts of reading that the National Reading Panel all said were important. Underlying those parts, though, of reading are 3 sensory cognitive functions that really make reading possible. And it's what we all do naturally as good readers. We know a lot about phonemic awareness now. We sure do. And it's, in case you don't know, it's the ability to perceive sounds and words, right? Simply put. Symbol imagery is that ability to picture letters for those sounds, also just as important, right? And concept imagery is that ability to create an image gestalt or whole. This really is the sensory system that allows us to engage in language, which is kind of why we read, right? So here's something to think about, though. Phonemic awareness is the most assessed skill. We all know that. While concept imagery is the most important, it's the least assessed and actually the most assumed, right? I think there's a myth out there that if a student's a good decoder, has a decent vocabulary, comprehension will come. And we know we've all seen that to be not true. Here's another way to think about it. If I were to ask you, and let's break this down a little bit more in a little bit more of a detailed way. If I were to ask you how many sounds in the word cat, you would be able to tell me there are 3 sounds, right? That first sound is a k sound, the second sound's an a sound, this last sound's a t sound. If I were to ask you about that first sound, and it was a k sound, and then subsequently ask you, what letters do you picture for that word? That first letter you're going to see is a C, right? You'd be able to do that. That's that visual piece I was talking about earlier. That orthographic processing enables us to recognize words and to commit words to memory, as we as good readers do. But why wouldn't we represent that first sound in the word cat with a K? Because orthographically, we know one looks better than the other. That visual circle is really important, especially for those words that don't play fair, right? You can't sound them out. Now, if I were to ask you to picture a cat, that's a whole different sensory system. Concept imagery is the foundation to vocabulary and language, right? And most importantly, comprehension is a culmination of all of those component parts. So weaknesses in one or more of those areas could really impact comprehension, which is the why we read. Okay. So let's talk about some other specific things that Haskin did in order to close the gap for their students. They integrated those sensory cognitive programs into their classroom content. They used core curriculum, but they didn't assume imagery, right? So they changed their questioning. Rather than asking a student the definition for a word, they asked him what he or she sees for that word. And not just what letters do they see for that word, but also conceptually, what do they picture for that word? And that questioning became a real-time formative assessment tool, right? You find out very quickly whether or not your student has the concept in an imagery kind of way versus they just aren't able to access it, maybe because it's a second language issue. So for those students who were not picturing, they were placed in a skills-based Tier 2 group in the classroom and worked that skill explicitly. They also used summer school as a initial heavy dose of intensive intervention for their students that were most struggling. So you can picture 3 to 4 hours a day for a minimum of 4 weeks for the summer. So they got a substantial amount of intensive instruction completely devoted to those deficits that those students were experiencing. So it was a great start to the implementation that they were taking on. And just in terms of programming, just so that you have this pictured, Haskin implemented seeing stars as their decoding intervention, which, as you know, addresses, or I should say, it does address the phonemic awareness and phonics and ultimately fluency. And they used visualizing and verbalizing as their comprehension intervention to address vocabulary and comprehension, right? So again, going back to those 5 component parts of reading. Here's another way to look at kind of the structure of this. This is our RTI model, which is pretty representative of what Haskin did to basically restructure their entire RTI model. Their RTI team established criteria for each of those tiers. As I mentioned, they integrated those sensory cognitive functions into their Tier 1 core instruction. They used DIBELS and MAP testing to progress monitor. Students who didn't show adequate progress were moved with, amongst those tiers as appropriate. But at Tier 2, that skills-based instruction and that small learning station in the classroom was key. It's the most fluid of the tiers, right? It's the place that students go before Tier 3. And while we talk a lot about working kids up the pyramid of interventions, like in terms of identifying them for appropriate intensive instruction potentially, we don't talk a lot about working them back down the pyramid. So Haskin did a fantastic job of using that Tier 2 as a fluid way to move those students up and down the pyramid. And keep in mind, all of those tiers were in alignment, right? So students who were below that 25th percentile were placed in a Tier 3 group, and students not progressing in Tier 2 would move up there. And all those Tier 3 students received that intensive time. It was a minimum of 90 minutes a day, 5 days a week. And again, that's one of those other very few things that researchers all agree on is to be considered intensive instruction, it has to be a minimum of 90 minutes a day. Younger students could potentially be seen for less time, for sure. But keeping that parameter in mind is key to getting the most appropriate instruction to students who need it the most. All right. And also keep in mind that if a student had goals that they were working on in tiers 2 and 3, that matched their goals in Tier 1, just in a different environment. So we were always working and targeting the same skills. It was the amount of time and the kind of group that they were in were the big variables there. All right, and here's some other things that they did. Just kind of quickly go through these. They absolutely established an RTI team. And not only was it a team of staff members who were talking about student progress, they were representative of all of the different specialty staff. So school psych, speech and language pathologists were involved in this process, special ed teachers, anyone who's a decision maker for that specialty staff, that subgroup for special ed were involved. Grade level leaders, so having content areas represented there. And classroom teachers are the ones who spend the most time with these kids. So of course they're a part of this RTI team. And of course administrators. You need someone who's a decision maker who has the power to make decisions about the schedule. They determined common assessments as a group. They controlled for whether or not they were measuring decoding and comprehension. And they also made sure that those assessments were representative of those 5 component parts of reading. They established a common planning time. They made it a priority to discuss student progress, right? We all know that that's important, but they designated early release days for these. They also even moved to a 4-day-a-week schedule for students and used that 5th day to PLC those kids, right, to team those students. And they track students using common assessments, but also common language. They were talking about student goals and skills exactly the same way, speaking the same language there. So once they aligned their assessments and instruction, they were able to efficiently discuss progress and plan for instruction in a really targeted way, which is really key. So what are your next steps? I think that's sort of what everyone's maybe thinking about now. I hope you are anyways. If you haven't established an RTI team, that's your first step for sure. And make sure that that group is representative of all those subgroups, right? Title I, ELL, special ed, gen ed, making sure that there's someone from every part of the teaching team there. I think that we run into a lot of issues with redundancy in assessments and all that, mostly because we don't have professionals talking to one another. And I know time is limited for all of you there at a building level for sure, but you've got to make it a priority or the outcomes don't change. Inventory all of your assessments that you're currently using. Determine whether or not, determine what skill it's measuring. Even take it back to those sensory cognitive functions I talked about earlier, those 5 component parts of reading. Figure out which ones are measuring which skill. And when you do that, what you're going to see is really quickly lots of redundancy there, especially with regards to phonemic awareness and word attack. Carve out that PLC time. You've got to be able to discuss the student progress, and you've got to be able to use that information to drive instructional decisions. That's the bottom line. Always making sure that those instructional goals align with the skills that you're measuring. So, simply put, does the task on the lesson plan match the deficit you measured in the first place? And I think that's a nebulous thing for a lot of classroom teachers that are just taking this on for the first time. But if you've got all those things, all those systems in place to talk about it, to measure it, to assess for it, that's the first step, because that means that everyone's speaking that same language, and that becomes easier as well. And most important, I can't stress this enough, protect instruction time for struggling students. I think this is the hardest thing to control for, but you've got to make sure that the needs of students are driving the schedule, not the convenience of us adults. I know that that's really hard to get everyone to agree to a master schedule, but while it's difficult, that's what's going to make the difference for your students in the end. To give you a better idea, I have another example for you. I have a district that we've been working with for about 5 years, a little over 5 years now. And when we first started working with them, their total student population for K to 6 was 319 students. Out of that 319 student population, 200 of those students were Tier 3 students, according to the state of Wyoming, per their assessments. And that was alarming. I think obviously it was for them, but it wasn't something they didn't already know. And they were able to make such sweeping schedule changes that they were able to see those students in Tier 3 intervention. All of those students eventually were able to be seen throughout the course of the school year. They went from 200 Tier 3 students, so you can picture it, right? Their pyramid is upside down, it's inverted, right? They have more Tier 3 students than it's the majority of the population there. So now not only have they righted their pyramid, they only have 33, as of last school year, they had 33 Tier 3 students, which is just remarkable, and that was in 4 years' time. And they're on their way. They're knocking out vocabulary. So I'll be featuring them in the next webinar when we come to vocabulary. I'll talk about them and share some of their success stories, but also some of their strategies along with their challenges. But all that to say, we know so much now about the role that cognition plays in literacy and language acquisition. And if we ask the right questions, we can target and be prescriptive in all of our instruction. So I hope that helps. Thanks so much. I'm really excited to hear some questions now. I think I'm ready for those.
So we had a lot of good questions, Melissa. One of the questions that I thought would be great to dive into would be a teacher who asked, so we always have we always group special education kids separately from ELL and struggling readers. Do you join these groups together or keep them separate?
That's a great question. We get this a lot. And I think, honestly, most of our successful school partnerships have gotten away from compartmentalizing those services. And lots of great things have happened because of that. But I think that, remember, more than 80% of the students who are on IEPs in the United States are there because of reading. And we know that that specific learning disability label, the SLD label, isn't very specific at all. So that label isn't really helping us in that group setting. And what they're measuring, they're looking at the component parts of reading in their assessments and determining who fits best together based on that skill set. So it makes more sense for them to group students per their need rather than their label. Because as we all know, that the label can be somewhat not helpful. So yeah, I mean, I think that it's a great question. Sometimes it's hard to get around that, the funding tied to the personnel who is seeing those students at certain times of the day. But it's possible, and they make it happen. I think also looking at it in terms of it's a long-term solution. You don't always, the amount of tier 3 students you start out with are not the amount of students you end up with, essentially, right? Because you're triaging, those numbers go down. So while it's a big issue in the beginning, it doesn't remain an issue forever. But yeah, great question. So thanks for that one.
So the next question I think relates to Haskin, which is the school you were talking about, and the question is, what happened to kids who were not able to attend summer school?
Ooh, yeah. So yeah, there are obviously lots of students. You can't, most students can't be forced to come to summer school. Some schools do actually mandate it. In this case, that wasn't the case. So students came on a voluntary basis. And if they weren't able to come to summer school for some reason or just didn't come, they were placed in a tier 3 group in the fall. So instead of seeing them over the course of a summer for about 60 hours of instruction over the summer, that same 60 hours was accomplished during the first semester. And, for students who didn't still belong in a tier 3 group, exited that environment at semester break. But if they still needed that tier 3 instruction, they stayed in group, and maybe the groups changed. But yeah, any student who needed tier 3 instruction received it there, even if they didn't attend summer school. Yeah, great question.
Great. And then I think we've got time for one more. So the next question is, we have different groups of people giving different assessments for different purposes, such as special education. And it's at different times. None of it's available to everyone. How do you handle this?
Ooh, thank you so much for asking that question. That's a really good one. I think a lot of the topics, or a lot of the things that I talked about earlier in inventorying your assessments and getting everyone on that RTI team to be representative of the entire teaching team, I think cuts down on this problem. And this is something I see in every district I think I've ever been in. In taking on a comprehensive RTI approach, or an MTSS model, whatever you're calling it, as leaders in your buildings, you've got to have a shared vision of what we're going to do moving forward with that model. And so if that's the shared vision, not only is it more efficient, right? So you're not over testing students. The more collaboration you have at a building level, you're going to cut down on redundant assessments for sure. But if we have professionals who are assessing students in these different environments and they're not talking about it, what are the chances that you might end up with 4 different, assessments that are measuring phonemic awareness? Pretty likely, right? So we know that students are over-tested. We know that we don't want to give them yet one more test to take. So I think the logistical things that I talked about earlier are going to really eliminate, at least, drastically reduce that from happening, but ultimately eliminate it. I mean, and that's not really even something we talk about so much anymore in places where we've been partnering for a long time. That sort of just goes away. It's a non-issue at some point. But yeah, I think that, I think if you keep in mind in terms of those assessments, no redundancy, and do they measure those 5 component parts of reading, you're set. And everyone's communicating about that, you're all set. Thanks so much.